From the Historyogi Podcast, this is Dave. Across Malaysia and Singapore, thousands of historic buildings are richly ornamented with motifs drawn from ancient Greece and Rome. These classical details mix with ideas drawn from other architectural traditions from across Asia in a style that is unique to this region. Today, we speak to Dr Soon-Tzu Speechley, lecturer in urban and cultural heritage at the University of Melbourne, about his book Malayan Classicism, which explores how the British Empire's classical architecture was transmitted, translated, and transformed in the hands of local builders and architects. So thanks very much, Sun-Tzu, for joining us today. To start off, what inspired you to research architecture in colonial Malaya and Singapore?
Hi, Devin. Thanks for having me. Well, this is architecture that I grew up very familiar with. I was born and raised in Kuala Lumpur, and as a child, I spent a lot of time sort of exploring the old town within the center of Kuala Lumpur, taking photos and sketching the buildings around Dataran Merdeka. We also used to go as a family on holiday quite often up into Penang, and I was always, really interested in, I guess, that sort of landscape of old shop houses. My family also often went down to Singapore, and so, I sort of spent a lot of time exploring Chinatown as a child there as well.
What sources did you rely on for your research, and did you discover anything particularly noteworthy?
So with architectural history, you get to draw on a whole range of different types of sources. It's one of the reasons I find this branch of history so interesting. You, of course, have the buildings themselves as a form of evidence, but then going through, for example, in the National Archives of Singapore, there's a fantastic collection of historic building plans that covers, almost everything from the 1880s onwards. But I also found myself relying a lot on newspapers to get a sense of how people responded to buildings when they were constructed. And aside from that, things like government correspondence, particularly for public buildings, where you find records of, the government kind of debating expenditure and the location of buildings, whether it be things like a courthouse or a new mosque.
Now, your book particularly focuses on Malayan classicism, and you write that classical architecture became the choice for educational institutions in Malaya and Singapore during that period. As a case study, you highlight St. Joseph's Institution and the Tao Nan Chinese School in Singapore. How did they adopt and customize architecture for the perceptions they wanted to create in society?
Yeah, so I think classicism becomes this dominant language, this, kind of way of expressing imperial power. But very quickly, it kind of gets adopted beyond the British imperial kind of administration and used by other communities. And those two buildings that you cite are a great example of different communities kind of drawing on this same language in different ways. So St. Joseph's, for example, was built by the Catholic Church, and it was for, the education of students within a kind of Catholic context. And here you see the sort of French priest architect, Charles Benedict Nain, drawing on kind of, I guess, the traditions of, Baroque Europe. And so in some ways, those kind of curved wings that sort of envelope the entrance facing Bras Basah Road, that, evokes, I guess, the entrance to Vatican City, culminating in this central kind of Baroque dome, which, really kind of evokes, I guess, the Catholic tradition. With the Tao Nan School, you have a very different, I guess, kind of approach to classicism, where it's the Chinese community wanting to sort of show their place within Straits society at the turn of the 20th century. And here you see the Chinese community, particularly, this Hokkien community, employing Tan Seng Chong to design a sort of statement piece for the school. And this too uses classical elements. You have those kind of Corinthian columns and a central pediment. But if you look at how the building's designed, it almost kind of evokes a shop house with its kind of arcaded verandas. There's this sort of almost 5-foot way kind of design. And so you see the sort of tastes and preferences of the different communities, I guess, expressed through their architecture.
Now, you take issue with an earlier author, Lee Kip Lin, who described classical architecture applied in Malaya and Singapore by local architects as plagiarized from Western sources. Now, he even labeled it unsophisticated and incorrect. Now, you argue that adaptation, translation, and extension of ideas was more common instead. So why did the plagiarism perception take hold, and why do you argue against it?
So I think kind of is really about how we understand classicism. And there is a strong tradition of kind of thinking about classicism purely in terms of these very kind of ancient handed down mathematical proportions and these, kind of strict rules in grammar that come from ancient Greece and Rome. But if we look at, architecture outside of Southeast Asia, even in, say, Renaissance Europe or, England through the sort of 17th century, what we see is architects kind of playing around with these rules and this vocabulary that's inherited from ancient Greece and Rome. And so what I kind of saw when I was reading this kind of architecture in the Malayan context was that these ideas are being adapted in a kind of fairly consistent way. And so for me, if we understand classicism as a language, as one that's shaped by its vocabulary, shaped by its grammar. For me, the sort of best analogy when we look at this architecture in Malaysia and Singapore is really kind of languages like Baba Malay or Penang Hokkien or even Singlish, where, a Creole language develops out of the contact between all of these different cultures and civilizations. And so for me, the kind of architecture that we see, in the shop house, particularly where Western elements are being grafted onto, kind of Chinese architectural forms with the courtyard and things. What we're having is really an act of translation rather than one of, sort of straight up plagiarism. And yes, we're looking for kind of that mathematical purity of ancient Greek architecture. We're not necessarily going to find that in these Malayan buildings, but instead I think there's something much more interesting at play. There's this act of translation and act of dialogue that's happening in this very complex colonial society.
In Chapter 5, you discuss the architectural output of the firm Swan and McLaren, which was responsible for many iconic commercial buildings in Singapore and Penang. How did they embed the symbolism of empire into their designs?
So I think Swan and McLaren is, this really sort of iconic firm. It's almost synonymous with Singapore architecture, particularly through the 19th and 20th centuries. And these architects are, coming from different parts of the British Empire and bringing ideas with them. And what you see in their designs, particularly for things like banking buildings along Collier Quay and in institutional buildings around Raffles Place, is that they're really kind of up to date with the trends that are happening across the British Empire. And so there's this sort of direct symbolism, whether it's, kind of using architectural motifs that convey, kind of Britannia or, the kind of ocean analogies about the British Empire. But there's also the fact that these buildings are, in some ways kind of siblings or cousins of the buildings that are going up on the Shanghai Bund or in Liverpool. These are, both, kind of physical manifestations of imperial trade networks, but they're also symbolic, they're showing kind of maritime power and commercial strength and really reflecting, I guess, Singapore's growing importance as this major hub within the imperial maritime network.
In the late 1930s, classicism appeared to increasingly fall out of favor in public architecture. You used the old Supreme Court building, which is now part of the National Gallery, as a case study. Why did the building receive a critical backlash, and what was the eventual fate of classicism in Malaya and Singapore?
Yeah, I think the Supreme Court is a really interesting example of this phenomenon. It's the grandest classical building that was ever constructed in Malaya, but almost the moment it opens its doors, you see letters to the editor in publications like the Straits Times complaining about their sort of disappointment in the building and also at the use of public funds for this, kind of huge monument. This had never really happened before. So classical architecture had been used really from the time of British colonization in Singapore right through to the Second World War. But I think architectural fashions were beginning to change in the 1930s. There was an increasing kind of emphasis on sort of functionality and functionalism, the idea that, things should be a bit more streamlined from ornament, but also that, I guess some of the symbolism of empire was not sitting well in the context of this sort of nascent, national identity that was forming in Malaya in the sort of mid-20th century. I think there was also, just broader concerns about the use of public expenses. When you look through papers from this particular period in time, a lot of the articles are about kind of concerns about what's happening in Europe and sort of Japan's militarization. And so this big showy statement piece of empire, which was meant to communicate imperial power, is also seen as a massive waste of public funds. And what you see really is not just in public architecture, sort of architectural tastes more broadly are starting to change. So While in the 1920s, for example, you have this great flowering of very kind of ornamental, kind of, what's often called Straits eclectic architecture, which has this real profusion of different ornaments. By the 1930s, we're starting to see, the influence of Art Deco, for example, as this very fashionable style, and a much more stylized, simplified form of ornamentation taking hold not just in public buildings, but in, the residential architecture of Singapore. And so as we move into the sort of late 1930s, there's a real kind of growth of, interest in modernism as well, and this sort of stripped back kind of lack of ornamentation. And we see this in Frank Dorrington Ward's own work in the Kallang Aerodrome, for example, where there is, kind of this walls of glass and a very kind of pared back ornamental palette that's used for the building.
What would you say is the legacy of classical architecture in modern Malaysia and Singapore?
So I think this is an interesting kind of style in that, superficially it's one that's introduced by colonizers, but I think it tells a much more complicated story than that. It's a style of architecture that really gets shaped by the hands of local and migrant builders and architects. It's one that ends up reflecting the kind of cosmopolitan environment of late colonial Malaya and Singapore through its ornamental vocabulary. And these buildings really make up the bulk of our built heritage today. If you go to whether it's Georgetown and Penang or Malacca, or if you look through sort of the conserved buildings in Singapore's historic districts, the bulk of these buildings are in some form of the classical style. And I think what these buildings really represent is that kind of development, I guess, or an attempt to create a sort of new national identity. It's one that incorporates both these Western influences alongside influences from China, India, and the Malay world, and one that really kind of adapts to the tropical environment of Malaya as well. So it's one that shows these ideas kind of responding to the local climate as well as the local culture. And so they're, important parts of our built heritage, but I think they're also, models in some ways for how we might approach building in the future. How do we address kind of a very multicultural society? How do we deal with a changing climate? All of these questions are things that we can take inspiration from, I guess, in this particular heritage.